I'm Allison Rudnick. I am an assistant curator in the Department of Drawings and Prints. I oversee the ephemera collection. The ephemera collection constitutes works in our collection that weren't necessarily intended to be works of art. And so most of that material is advertising material, and of course baseball cards fall under that category. So I oversee the baseball card collection here. So normally we display our cards chronologically, starting from the 1880s, which are the earliest cards that we have in the collection, and ending in the 1950s or 60s, since the collection ends in the 1960s. We decided to start with the Jackie Robinson rookie card in this case because, as you probably know, Jackie Robinson would have celebrated his 100th birthday at the end of January, around the time that this installation opened. So we wanted to commemorate Jackie Robinson and what he did for the sport by installing his rookie card. If you take a look, it's actually a beautiful card. It's really fun. There's a bright yellow background. It's very poppy and bold. It was produced in the late 1940s, and it was produced by Leaf Gum. In the 1930s, gum companies, bubblegum companies, took over as the leading producers of baseball cards from tobacco. And a lot of these companies would invest a lot in the production of these cards, the illustration of these cards. You had some fantastic, really talented illustrators who were hired by these companies to come up with appealing and poppy graphic design to appeal to collectors. And this is a fantastic card that collectors get very excited about, not only because it's the rookie card of one of baseball's most famous players and most significant players, but also because it's really fun and beautiful. So cabinet cards are large. People sometimes can't believe their eyes when they see these cards because they're so big. They're called cabinet cards because they were actually often installed in people's cabinets in their homes, and they were produced in the 1880s. They're actually albumin photographs. They're beautiful. The photographer of these cards has been identified. He invited players to his studio, and so you can actually see that these players are placed against backdrops that are meant to look like baseball fields. The photographer would often hang baseballs from the ceiling in order to capture his shot. So the white border cards, which are quite well known among collectors, were produced between 1909 and 1911 by the American Tobacco Company. I think it was around 1907 that the American Tobacco Company was indicted for violating the Sherman Antitrust Act, which outlawed monopolies, because the American Tobacco Company was a merger, essentially. And so Duke Buchanan, who was the CEO of the American Tobacco Company, knew that his company was going to dissolve soon. And so in kind of one final push, he decided to produce, at that time, one of the largest series of baseball cards to have been produced up to that date. And they're beautiful. There are hundreds of them, and they include the famous Honus Wagner card, of course. They're not the first example of colored cards. Cards in the 1880s, some of those actually were produced in color, but they are early examples of commercial lithographs, which is a process that really came to prominence in the 19th century. And they're very beautifully illustrated. Some of the players are shown against solid color backgrounds. Others have this kind of ombre colored background, and so they're not the first, but they definitely set a precedent for later cards. The DeLong cards are really fantastic. So in the late 1920s, bubblegum was invented. Before that point, gum was marketed to audiences as a medicinal product, and it was marketed really towards adults. With the advent of bubblegum, suddenly gum companies came up with this brilliant idea of marketing to children and to young adults instead. And so these bubblegum companies started putting out lots of baseball cards, and by the 1930s had taken over as the leading producers of baseball cards. And they put a lot of resources into hiring some of the best illustrators around. And so many of the cards that were produced in the 1930s and 1940s by Bubblegum companies are some of the most beautiful, fun, bold, exciting cards that we have. I mean, these are unique in that we don't see any cards that look exactly like this, but this is the period where you have illustrators who are getting really creative. And something that I like to point out is, people are often surprised to hear that the Metropolitan Museum of Art has one of the largest public collections of baseball cards of any museum. But if you look at pop art, you can see the parallels. I mean, pop artists were looking at this kind of material for inspiration. And they were also using, one of the stories that this collection tells is not only the history of American visual culture and advertising, but also printmaking processes. And they are held in the drawings and prints department for that reason. They illustrate the different kinds of printing techniques that were used for commercial purposes.